How's the royal family today? I pray that everyone is doing well. Well, my royal family, today what I'm going to do is restart the King series. And if anyone is new to my YouTube channel, my first YouTube channel was hacked, and there's still an investigation going on. And what I was doing was I was doing this series in honor of our kings. And I started it in the month of June because I noticed that's when the disrespect of our kings is heightened because of Father's Day. So I was doing this series. I would put out a video every day, and I would go as far back into our history as possible. And I even learned some stuff, and I did not know the true name of Africa is ALKEBULAN. So it was a learning experience for me too as well. Well, in order to restart the King series, which I said I will always do it now, not just for a particular month, we have to start at our origin. And let me see here. Let me click this on. Right here, ALKEBULAN, and I'm not going to read all this stuff. The land of the blacks. The original name is ALKEBULAN, land of the blacks. Then let me click here because I love this symbol, and I'm going to show it again. This is so powerful to me. ALKEBULAN. That is the true name of the motherland, and we have to know our history. I have to know it because I didn't know, like I said before, and it touched me deep. It really did, to learn more about us, because the type of person that I am, I feel immensely hurt and lost because I can feel in the depths of my souls of us being stripped from our true selves. Now, the one thing that I want the royal family to realize, we ruled the entire planet at one time, but it has to start somewhere. And ALKEBULAN is where everything starts. We all know this. This is the motherland. And so I found this video, and I had put it on my first channel. I'm going to replay a video which is quite long because there is no way that I or we can explain our true history in some little 10 and 5-minute or even 20-minute videos. And I know people don't like listening to long videos. Some, I'm going to say some. But if you want to truly know self, you have to take the long route. So with that said, my royal family, I'm going to play this video. And here it is. Let me click here. And I'm going to start this video and enjoy it. Don't have to try to listen to it all at once, but this is a real good video to listen like on an off day from work, or if it's some garbage on TV like it usually is. Learn about yourself. Have our royal babies also watch this video, because this video, I mean, it spoke volumes to me. So with that said, my royal family, enjoy our true history.
Sa የነገን ስዕል ስትስል ስትሰይ ያለፉትን ጊዜያት ህብረ ቀለሞች ትስላለህ ትስያለሽ በእናት ሀገር ከርስ የተሳሉ ህብረ ቀለሞች ንጉሶች ፈርዖኖች ስልጣኖች ይችን ታላቅ ምድር ዞሩ የጊዜ ቁጥር አሸዋ ወደ ኋላ ፈሰሱ የታሪክ መቃብሮች ተበርግደው ተከፈቱ
Africa, see yourself, know yourself. Mighty, ancient, beautiful Africa. Creator of the human being, of music, of dance, of language, speech.
It is the original home of human life. It is the birthplace of civilizations.
Not only the cradle of mankind, but a cradle of technology. The oldest technology in the world is stone technology, is dated back 2.6 million years ago.
When I think of Africa in its glorious period. I think of the great civilizations in West Africa, in Southern Africa, and East Africa. When I think of Africa, I think of culture and civilization, great kingdoms, great technological achievements in architecture, in engineering, in medicine, in philosophy, in literature that have stood the test of time. That is what Africa means to me.
Africa is the oldest civilization on earth.
Africa is the mother of all civilizations. All of them came from our loins.
If you go back and you look at what Africans did, the first people who crossed a river, the first people who decided how to build shelter, the first people who decided geometry, how to count, the names of the days of the week, the first people who created forms of architecture, the first people who gave to the world a sense of family, the first people who gave to the world some notion of ritual. These were African people.
What cannot be debated, what cannot be questioned is that there are historical relics now across the continent which conclusively prove that African civilizations have been among the most advanced in the world.
We've got physical landmarks, we've got pyramids in what they call modern-day Egypt or Kemet, also Sudan. If we talk about Zimbabwe, great Zimbabwe, many of the wonders of the world that we'll find in the African world, then we will see that the peoples that lived then created great structures, they created great empires, but they left that as a legacy for us today.
When people talk about the longevity of African nations, you have to look back at the history of Africa. Kemet lasted for 4,000 years, and then Ghana lasted from 300 BC to 1242 when it was finally defeated by Sundiata, the king of Mali.
Everybody knows that Sundiata Keita was the founder of the Mali Empire, which was in a territory from the Atlantic Ocean to the Lake Chad. All this territory was the Mali Empire.
This is an extremely important story to understand, for us to tell people that Africa has persisted. It has sustained itself. There were values and traditions, and there were great institutions that were created that allowed people to live and to experience these kinds of things for so long.
When we are coming to modern human ancestor, all the people their homies from Africa, specifically from Ethiopia.
Africans went out to populate the world. Of course, in that process, over centuries and centuries and billions of years, mankind, humankind was transformed into all of its different expressions and forms.
And we discovered Homo sapiens equal to 160,000 years ago. He became the grandfather of the whole peoples of the world. He became the father of Far East, Asia, Europe, America, and so on.
Africa had a special place in the scheme of things, including its strategic location, that in fact it's the most central of all continents in terms of location on planet Earth, because the only continent that's cut almost in half by the equator, and the only continent which is traversed by both the tropics of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn, and has these two oceans surrounding it, with extensive implications for our contact with Asia through the Indian Ocean and our contact with the Western world through the Atlantic Ocean.
Motherland! Assalamu alaikum.
We didn't start being African because we got to America, and we can't stop because we're here. We're African forever. African, they said in the 60s in us organizations, it's not just an identity, it's also a destiny, and therefore a duty. We were African forever. Therefore, we have a moral obligation to make this the best life possible and to give our lives to making sure we leave a legacy worthy of the name and history African.
Number one, first you have to realize that up until 1959, Africa was dominated by the colonial powers, and by the colonial powers of Europe having complete control over Africa. They projected the image of Africa negatively. They projected Africa always in a negative light. Jungles, savages, cannibals, nothing civilized. And naturally it was so negative until it was negative to you and me. And you and I began to hate it. We didn't want anybody to tell us anything about Africa, much less call us an African. And in hating Africa and hating the African, we ended up even hating ourselves without even realizing it. Because you can't hate the roots of a tree and not hate the tree.
No matter your nationality, you have the identity of an African. I'm only mimicking poorly Peter Tosh, the late Peter Tosh. Basically, there's a long ancestry. There's a long history. You see, think of the fact that if you have African blood in you and you're in the West, for example, you somehow inevitably always get discriminated against, one way or the other. So you might think you're not African, etc. You were born in the Caribbean, West Indies, in England, in Europe, America, etc. But you still have that sense of connection.
Africans are people of African descent, historically, and who have ultimately African cultural roots.
What really made me start this mission was I did a speaking engagement in the United States during Black History Month. And there was a little boy there. I was dressed like this. His name was Jonathan. And I said, he said, "Oh, you look pretty." I said, "Oh, thank you very much." And I said, "Well, I live in Africa. I live in Ghana." I said, "And you're an African." He said, "Oh, no. I'm not African." And you see, in Africa, you have wars, you have famines. They don't take care of their people. So I am definitely not an African. That in itself really showed me the importance of exposing our young people to their roots.
They say literally, I'm not an African. Like, come on, look at your color. You are an African whether you like it or not. And that's, from Malcolm X, that's the phrase I like for those who don't think they're an African. You just happen to be.
And I think it is only when Africans everywhere think of themselves first and foremost as Africans, not as British citizens, not as Americans.
just what do you call it? Simply just to do with skin color.
Africans are very diverse, and we comes in all, shapes, color, sizes, and I really reject Europeans coming up with a definition of what an African should look like.
So, you see, there is a dilemma even there. They used to call the Roman Empire, they used to call Hic sunt leones, here you find lions, or Abyssinia, the whole continent of Africa, the land of the black man, and then Africa came into place but it was always others who defined them, and we use that terms, but it's something that has to be revised.
We have to wash our brains of this image of Africa that has been fashioned, created, and even patented by Europeans.
Africa was not a continent that was based upon color or any set features. It was a blending of people of different colors and different features. It wasn't like Europe.
It has to do also with socialization and a certain way of living. But the reason why that gap exists is that people who haven't been to Africa don't feel connected, haven't had that socialization. So basically, they have to undergo it somehow.
There are basically three groups of people living in Africa. They're Africans, they're Europeans, and they're Arabs. And both Europeans and Arabs have been saying that they're African when it suits their purpose. We must be careful that we distinguish nationality and citizenship from identity in this question.
If I go to India tomorrow, and I live in India, do I then become an Indian? You've got to be a bit careful about that.
Now, your identity is your history, your geography, and the values that grow out of that, a whole range of issues that go to make up a distinctive identity. It is the thing that holds a group of people together. It's that invisible thing that tells people how to behave in specific circumstances. It's that specific thing that enables people to identify, defend, or promote their interests in a flash.
So you get your identity from two sources: historical origin and social location. Where'd you originally come from? Well, you didn't come from Paris. We didn't come from the moon. You see, we came from Africa. So we're African. Where are we now? We're in America. So we're African American. That seems simple to me. If I was in Brazil, we're African Brazilians or Afro-Brazilians. So it's the same thing with other places where you were outside of Africa, i.e. in the diaspora. We say we're African first, and then we locate the place we are.
Today, African people have to have a debate that will fix, as much as one could fix these things, African identity, which is different from the identity of the Afrikaners in South Africa, or of the English and the other Europeans in Kenya. Various peoples may have an African passport. It says, I belong to this state or this super state called Africa. But it doesn't mean that all of them are identifiable culturally in the same group. And very often we make this mistake of mixing up identity with nationality.
If we're honest, we have to recognize that being African today is actually quite futuristic. We're not saying that we're going back to how we used to live 500 years ago, because 500 years ago we didn't necessarily have a common African identity. But part of repairing ourselves would be to repair some of the weaknesses that we had in some of our ancient systems, some of the quirks even in our identities. And we have to reformulate that. And we have to look at what is required today. You know, what is it we have to do? What is the legacy we're going to leave?
We need to revert back to what our forefathers used to say, that we need to be proud to be African. So all these values are human values in my understanding. So we therefore need to ensure that we preserve that African heritage. And the only way to preserve that African heritage, we need to transmit from generation to the next so that these things are not forgotten.
Black sheep, have you any room? Yes, sir, master, 3 bags full. Who's a master? And if there's a master, automatically there's a slave. And our children sing this all over in the nurseries, in Africa, in the West, everywhere. And it shapes their minds and their imaginations and they grow up with it. So live African, be African.
But many of us are happy to be called black people. Now, Europeans come from Europe. Africans come from Africa. You know, Asians come from Asia, Chinese from China, Indians from India. I want to know if there's any country that's called black as a way of identifying a cultural and historical entity that has a specific attachment to a particular geography. It's inadequate, the term black, for representing us.
In other words, the cultural and the historical realities, plus the psychological realities, are more primary than the physical skin color.
We have forgotten the importance, not just of education, but you having the power to define your terms of reference. And in our fall, we have forgotten that freedom or independence, we are not free until we're able to reconnect with our own terms of reference or power to define our inherent creating genius. That means we should be able to go out into reality, take what is in reality and see how it works with us. What works with the dog doesn't work with the cat. What works with the African evidently may not work with the European. You come from 2 different cultural or bio systems. So you definitely have a different way you resonate to those biosystems. And it is inherent in the creation. You are placed in there to be able to reflect another kind of reality from those areas.
Terminology articulates ideology. Terminology is the scaffolding through which ideology, worldview, is articulated in language. And it is very important for African people especially, but other people in general too, to be very, very careful in the way in which we encounter and interact with terms, especially terms that are used to describe us and things about us.
I always ask young people, name me one product that was created, produced, manufactured, and
distributed worldwide from the continent of Africa. I'm not talking about gold, not talking about diamonds, not talking about oil. These are natural products come out of the earth. A product that Africans created that is being used worldwide on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis. It's one item. That's sold. That is sold. One item. But if actually the same question about Britain, well, let's say Japan. Japan. One item. Well, Lexus, Honda, Toyota, Sony, something. Now, this is the problem. Japan and Britain are islands. Africa is a continent.
One other very important avenue when you look at any economy of any country, you want to look at the relationship between production, ownership, and consumption. Unfortunately, everything that you see here still belongs to the whites. We rent it, we buy it, or we hire it, but it still belongs to them. So the infrastructure is the basis of development, and until such time that the infrastructure is owned by the indigenous people, we are going to have a problem addressing poverty and all these other things.
And the basis of our reconnection, to Africa and our restoration has to be about land. Because this has to be very concrete now. It can't just all be metaphysical and spiritual and philosophical. It has to be about a daily struggle to improve the welfare of our people on the ground.
We are tackling the land economic program, and that is working very well. We have got to look at other areas like mining and begin to organize our mining activities effectively to benefit the majority of the people of this country.
So we here in Africa, with all the raw materials, we should be waking up for economic growth, for bringing the machinery and these things that can make the final product.
There was a garment factory in Ethiopia which was producing white t-shirts. These t-shirts were exported to Italy. The Italians will put names and stamps in the front or the back of the t-shirt and send it back to us. We sell, say for example, the white t-shirt for $1, but we pay for a t-shirt having those designs on it for $10 or $20. I mean, this is something that can be done by Ethiopians.
Many times we look at things that we produce here, and in trying to export them, you have to jump through all kind of hoops for the World Trade Organization. If phytosanitary conditions are not met, you cannot export, but you have to import their goods, otherwise it's protectionism. We could go on and on and on.
Nigeria has a lot of oil. Ghana has had gold. What is it that stops exchanging all these things?
Currently, the volume of intra-African trade is just somewhere in the neighborhood of 8.9% of overall import and export, which is just not good at all.
Well, what about sending coffee to Ghana? When I'm in Ghana, I drink Nescafe. You understand? Because there's not great Ethiopian coffee that's there. Likewise, shea butter, wonderful shea butter. Here, this is a country where people are into grooming and they use various oils. Why isn't shea butter being exported and developed here in Ethiopia as a health beauty product? These are the kinds of exchanges that I see happening more and more if we start to concentrate on relaxing these borders and putting a strong economic plan, because we should have plans in place with it.
So this would allow Africans to work together. No visa, no restrictions. There's free movement of goods and services. There's free movement of people. So that in order to achieve that, you must belong to an African Union. So the Pan-African is very, very important. No matter how big you are,
you can only be better if we all work together.
One of the classic features of globalization is that the United States people will tell a government in Africa, say Ghana or Nigeria or wherever, that, you know, you have to make certain that you don't create any barriers to trade. Now, what this means in practice is that African people cannot give subsidies to their farmers, for example, while in Europe and America, farmers are paid subsidies. They're paid to produce nothing. But the African must not do what they've been doing for generations.
So these are the values of neoliberal globalization. There should be a free market, that foreign capital should be able to pour into a country and dominate it. There should be privatization of everything. Even the British government actually set up an agency with the World Bank to pressurize African countries to privatize their utilities. This is one of the things they were doing in Sierra Leone, that everything should be privatized so that the financial institutions can make money, even out of water supplies, everything.
We have everything of water all over the world. 40% of the world water is from Africa, but we don't have good water. We don't have access to water. You see, and all these things are expensive. So if you are not working, how can you survive?
With globalization, there is quite a lot of imbalance in terms of the rules of engagement as they affect Africa, particularly because the process of globalization has forced African countries to go through certain structural adjustment programs that have left them worse off than they were before they implemented those programs. You know, so the rules of engagement aren't really fair.
That's really very important, because if it's about globalization, what have you got to bring to that global table? You simply want to be swamped up in this globalization. What have you got to contribute to this global table?
But as a matter of fact, globalization itself gives Africa certain windows that need to be exploited.
The corporate world rules our lives in many ways. They own literally 80% of Africa. You know, the Coca-Colas, they own us. They own our home. They own our life.
The Africa of today is the Africa of the multinationals, the Africa of the World Bank, the Africa of the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the Africa of Western-funded NGOs. That's the Africa today. And that is the Africa that is still continuing to wreak havoc, not only on the minds, psyches and souls, but the material life of our brothers and sisters.
Yesterday I was in an article, and the gentleman was saying because the government wasn't giving incentives to the local farmers, the price of rice from the local farmers was much higher than the price from someone importing it into the country, because they were getting incentives, they were getting subsidies from the government, so they could market their rice much lower than the locally produced rice, which is not really fair, which is not good to the local farmer.
Was it 2 years ago or 2.5 years ago, the parliament in Accra in Ghana passed a law to protect local poultry farmers, because they found that the importation of chicken from abroad was killing the local industry. Beautiful law. It went through parliament, debate, they passed the law. 2 weeks later, some young man sitting in the office at the IMF called our president and said, you cancel that law passed by your parliament about poultry importation, or you lose this and that and that and that. And our president cancelling the law without even resorting to parliament, going back to parliament, cancelling the law, and poultry is being imported from everywhere into Ghana, killing the local poultry industry.
African countries are put in a tremendous bind. On one hand, they need to meet their short-term goals and needs, which has everything to do with debt forgiveness, treatment for HIV and AIDS, grants and loans from both bilateral sources and multilateral sources. So in many ways, African countries have to weigh policy decisions based upon the interests of the countries that they are relying on for aid.
Bartering, that was an old way of doing business, where if you don't have this monetary instrument, this currency, I could bring you 10,000 kilos of sugar and you could bring me 10,000 kilos of salt. Bartering, you need this, I need that.
If we think about a certain banking system that we have, we call it Hagbard in Somali. We don't really use banks, but we use our families, friends to save money. And I was told it's the same thing in Jamaica, for example.
In Jamaica, our thing called Susu, our partner. You know, it's almost a micro finance system, which many people can save up enough money to pay down on a house to do these kinds of things. We need to bring these systems back.
We have to look at what is the knowledge that we require today. What is the knowledge that we require today about developing sustainable economies? What is the knowledge that we require today about developing sustainable agriculture? What is that knowledge of, you know, planting crops and so forth, yielding in a way that we do not have in a continent of plenty, people starving? This is what we are talking about, the responsibility of being African.
The US and others like to present everything as if it's a unipolar world, they're the only power in the world and so on. But that's not the case. There are other countries, there are other parts of the world which are becoming stronger, becoming powerful and so on, which African countries can trade with and can cooperate with and so on. And then there are also the possibilities of African governments standing up to the demands of the IMF and the World Bank.
Why shouldn't the countries of the Caribbean establish a mutually beneficial economic, trade, political and cultural relationships with the nations of West Africa? Why shouldn't the Caribbean community, which is our regional organization of nation states, why shouldn't we have a working relationship with the economic community of West African states?
We should invite, we should create opportunity for the African diaspora to also come and showcase what products they can sell on the continent, what products they can come to the continent and produce for export to North America, to Caribbean and other places where the African diaspora lives. So there are tremendous opportunities in all of these areas, and I think the time has come now for us to take concrete steps and measures to actualize these potentials which we have recognized for a long time, talked about for a long time, but which we have not really created the institutional framework to realize. This is what we want to do. That's our immediate challenge.
We have to operate in a mindset in this continent that with today's globalized world, regional economies are grouping themselves like the NAFTA on the north and the European Union now. It's more than 450 million people producing 11 trillion US dollars of GDP. Is a huge block, and China and India, with the rate of growth they are going to be a huge block on their side. So Africa is a huge continent, but we have to work together and act like African Union, like the European Union.
At least I can speak from my own perspective as someone who was involved heavily in the new Partnership for Africa's Development, representing the Eastern African region on the steering committee. And I could see it from different perspectives, because you could find that, for example, let me take an example of the economic side. In East Africa, we had the common market for Eastern and Southern Africa. In Southern Africa, they had SADC
and then they had ECOWAS in the west, and then they had, of course, the one in the north, they had the one in the center, and they're all working differently. And then you could find countries like Rwanda was belonging to so many of them. We are members of the CAS, Economic Community for Central African States. We are members of COMESA. Now we are members of East African Community. We are members of the Great Lakes region. And being a member takes resources, takes time. And in this case, when we started working, we saw that actually there is a way of uniting all of them. All these barriers could be removed if you have an umbrella of how to implement those kind of changes. And that one was the African Union. There's no other way. Because otherwise, even trading among us as Africans was a problem.
Every day of the year, except Sundays and holidays, trains come to a halt at this siding in Johannesburg. Every day, they unload cheap cargoes of human labor. Without these men, the economy of South Africa would collapse.
All over the world, when you look around, in African communities, Africans are the buyers and other people are the sellers. Africans are not in business. Other people are in the business of selling Africans' business.
When we talk of economic development and Africa standing on its own 2 feet, you cannot have an advanced economy in which the indigenous population plays the role of simple labor. The population has to be involved at every level, from owning to working in those factories and facilities. Now, of course, this is an era of globalization, and there is cross-ownership everywhere, even in the United States. But the bulk of property and investment in the United States is American, as it should be. The bulk of investment and wealth in China is Chinese, as it should be. A similar process of development needs to take place in Africa if we are going to be properly developed.
If you come to economic opportunities and democratic rights, democracy says everybody should enjoy the economic benefits. How do you implement that? That's the question.
We started, as it were, with a clean slate. And therefore it was perhaps easier for us not to fall into the trap that our South African brothers have fallen into. In the case of South Africa, the population has been colonized in a unique and particularly pernicious manner for so long that it's only after the demise of apartheid that they are beginning to do something about it. And they are walking a very tightrope. On the one hand, they have to maintain the economy moving forward. On the other hand, they have to transform it in such a way that the African population there feels ownership of the whole process.
The economy in South Africa was racially structured. We are now saying it needs to be de-racialized and give those who had no opportunity the opportunity. You must then say, here are the opportunities. You guys deal with it. These companies are not allowed to come. They can't be everywhere. How do you regulate, in other words, the economic activities to fit in with the economic rights of the poor people in particular?
Because you only have to move around, you don't have to ask. You will see that if you see poverty, underdevelopment, you'll find Africans. If you see plush houses and so forth, you can tell that this is a white area.
Historically, if we talk about the slave and the slave owner was not African. The slave was an African. If we talk about colonialism, the colonized was an African. The colonizer was not an African. And therefore today, if we are talking about billionaires and millionaires, it's not an African. If we talk the masses of the workers are the Africans. We need to change that. And I don't think we could look up in the sky. We've got to do something. We've got to interact. We need now to say, what can we do to our position and be the masters in our own home, the continent.
Ghosts, watch out for the ghosts. Ghosts get you, ghosts. Watch out for the ghosts. In bitter darkness screams, sharpness as smells, as seas, black voice, wails in the death-filled darkness. Their bodies diseased beneath intoxicated floors. A sea shudder afraid it's turned to blood.
So when we go back to ancient times, we find that slavery was a worldwide institution. People were being made slaves in China, in India, in Europe, in Africa, in the Americas, all over the planet. Actually, the word slave comes from Slav, because the Romans were taking the northern people, the Slavic people, as slaves. And so it wasn't based upon any particular color or any particular nation. Now, when we look at the Atlantic slave trade, we find that this was something very much different, because it was color-based. In Africa and in the Middle East, the basis of slavery was prisoners of war.
People flattened, chained, bathed and degraded. A people flattened, chained, a people flattened, chained, bathed and degraded in their own hysterical waste. Below, beneath, underneath, deep down, up under, grave, cave, pit, lower, blue blood, hole into which blueness is the terror, massacre, torture, and a residual Western Holocaust.
And in the West, slavery is a very emotive issue. In the sense that, we don't like to hear anything about people being enslaved or people being oppressed or anything like that. So if you go on the walls of Egypt, in the walls of Egypt, you will have the powerful pharaoh with a mace smashing in the heads of the Persians, of the Assyrians, and of other African civilizations.
Instead of putting people in boxes and in buildings, African people integrated the prisoners of war into society. These people were able to eventually buy their freedom or to raise up in the ranks of the society, so that some of the slaves actually became the leaders of their societies.
In my language, in the Akan language, they say, Ubinchile Ubiechi. Ubinchile Ubiechi. That is, you do not pry into people's genealogy. This is in reference to the fact that in every family, in every lineage, in every household, there are people who were brought in, from conquest and so on, people who are absorbed in, and they marry immediately into the family.
Slaves, we were slaves, 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 we were slaves, 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 we were slaves, we were slaves, we were slaves, 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 we were slaves, slaves. They threw our lives away, we were slaves.
Walter Rodney is very clear and extremely informative on the mutual respect that Africans and Europeans had for each other at the inception of that relationship. It was generally the same with the Arabs and the Africans.
In Iraq, the Abbasid Khilafate was in its flowering age. And so, in order to clear the marshes, the Tigris and Euphrates is pouring into a huge marsh area, and salt was building up. And so they went out of the known practice of domestic slavery, and they brought in thousands of people from East Africa, who they called the Zinj, in order to clear the salt from the marshes in Iraq. This developed a type of ball and chain slavery, really for the first time in a massive amount within the Muslim world. What developed out of this is that a charismatic figure came amongst the African Zinj and they had a major slave rebellion in that area, and they were able to have their independence and to hold off the Abbasid Khilafat for a period of time. This was a very strong resistance to the corruption that had set in to the Abbasid Khilafat.
It definitely was a major shock to the Abbasid dynasty. This is a dynasty which had extensions into Europe at the same time. It interrupted the looking to Africa as a source of enslavement.
But once there was a sense of state and empire and enslavement of African people by Arabs, the vision of African people in the eyes of Arabs changed, and that became predominated by the vision of enslaved Africans. And when you read the works of people like Algiers, who were complaining against Arab racism, we come to understand that African people were actively discriminated against after the enslavement of Africans started, and that there was Arab racism towards African people. That still continues on to this day.
In order for the slave masters to go to bed at night, they had to convince themselves on some level, or try to tell themselves on some level, that we weren't human, that people of African descent weren't human, that we were animals. Beneath the violent philosophy of primitive cannibals, primitive, violent, steam-driven cannibals, but when you put your hand on your brother, made him a slave, watch out, Africa, the ghost gonna get you. When you put your hand on your sister, made her a slave, watch out, Africa. Watch out, Africa, the ghost gonna get you, Africa. Ah!
Now, who brought those ships? Who brought those ships in? You see, what I'm saying again is that basically we usually just have one side of the picture.
A lot of times they were ensnared in an economic relationship. Other times it was either you enslave your own people or they will enslave you. And the mechanism for this was often trade in arms and ammunition. But that's not too different from what is happening today. Or it was rum or some form of alcohol, trinkets, and so on. Very often, the way in which the legal code in a particular African community began to change in the way it operated. For example, crimes that were formerly punishable by some other sentence became punishable by being enslaved and exported.
And this does not diminish the Atlantic slave trade, because that minor form of integrative slavery that we found in Africa was changed into a major institution based upon purchase and kidnapping. And by the 16th century, the Code Noir, the black codes, were introduced, whereby in the Americas, a person's slavery was based upon color. And so, no matter what level of society you were in, if you were a person of color, you were a slave. And so, within the Atlantic slave trade, there was no upward mobility. It wasn't possible for a person from the slave class to ever raise up in society and become the leader of society. It is a totally different concept of slavery that we find. It is the most brutal, repressive form that ever existed on the planet.
The value system of treating that individual, was totally different. You can't put the two together, because he was treated just like a table, just like a shoe hoof, just like a chair. He was chattel. That means he was not human being. And even in 1865, this was nearly 400 years later, when the intellectual strength of the Western American system had to reevaluate what was his contribution in society. They, for purposes of taxation, said he was
it's another scale, another chapter, when you find that for 600 years, some people were carrying off others across the sea for thousands of miles in chains, mistreated, branded, hounded like animals. Then it's slavery, but it's slavery of a special kind.
It is one of the first forms of globalization. I would like to remind here that the slave trade, the African slave trade, affected all the continents without exception.
And slave trade and capitalism were right there. I mean, people have to keep in mind that the slave trade was one of the slave trading companies were some of the first publicly traded companies on the new stock markets of Europe. And the slave trading companies were some of the upstart companies when individuals were able to become sort of capitalists. Before that, it was feudalism. And before that, it was the church.
The slave trade is not only a historical event or an event of the past. I think we can understand the process of development of Europe and into Americas without understanding what happened during the slave trade and slavery. We know now that the research, more and more research show that the accumulation of capital that has been realized throughout the slavery period has permitted European countries to really engage into the industrialized era.
During the Atlantic slave trade, it was understood by the slave masters that a real slave is not just a person who is physically subjugated, but a person who is mentally in a state of slavery. And so, along with the chains of slavery on the body, there were chains of slavery in the mind. The traditional religions of West Africa and Southern Africa were substituted with a Trinitarian form of Christianity. White European culture was forced upon the people. Marriage was abolished. The institutions that flourished in African societies were not allowed on the slave plantations. And so what developed is the shell of an individual who was ashamed of his culture, ashamed of his name, and not connected to his people on the continent in any way or shape.
There was a time I think in 1850, about 1/3 of people of African descent were living outside the African continent, taken out as slaves because of Western processes.
How sweet the name of Jesus sounds in a believer's. You know when that was composed? When the slaves had been shackled and manacled and put on the ships that were bound for the West. And they were asked to, sing this song and kind of basically ask for forgiveness.
Slavery time, many people have made many unnecessary things, very selfish ones, very harmful ones, but that's only human activity. It's not God's doing.
At the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, there's a railroad made of human bones. At the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, there's a railroad made of human bones.
Slavery was a traumatic process, not only for those who were enslaved, but also for those who were left behind. Societies collapsed, social networks became weak, and it had impact well beyond the areas from where most of the slaves were taken. This was followed by colonialism.
After they had to get out of slavery, they designed another way to control Africa and African people, and that was to invade the continent and to set up and establish throughout the continent their own spheres of influence.
Your beloved country is free forever. We are going to demonstrate to the world
as how to transform a neo-colonial outpost of Western imperialism into a real country and a modern one also.
Initially, once African nations gained independence, political independence, they looked up and discovered that they did not have economic independence, they did not have psychological independence.
Ghana got a flag and an anthem in 1957. He didn't get real independence. He realized that he needed economic independence. And when he moved for economic independence to reorganize the country, he realized also that you couldn't move in the direction of economic independence with the old colonial state apparatus. Even though you may succeed in changing the state apparatus from a colonial one to something that is more forward-looking, you also had to tackle the minds of the people, certainly the so-called educated people.
In colonialism, every interest, Western interest, that took on some kind of real estate in Africa began to re-image those in that territory in their image and after their likeness. So Ghana became image after the British. Ivory Coast became image after the French. And each colonial interest began to make sure that there was no hurdle in the designing the mind to formulate either the French image or the British image.
Colonialism was basically underdeveloping Africa so that they could overdevelop Europe and America. You know, in a nutshell, it was about going in, subjugating the people, taking out all of the raw minerals, doing a brain and physical drain of all the healthy young people, bringing them to the West in order to work for free on these plantations and building these houses and doing everything that they have machines and computers to do today, in order to build the wealth of the West. Now, that's what that was the end game of colonialism. It was the underdevelopment of Africa. It was not only the underdevelopment, but the creation of false boundaries, the creation of situations that into the 21st century we're still feeling the repercussions of all those things that were done to Africa in order to enrich the West.
Now, that created a process whereby Africa became dependent on others, particularly Europe. After independence in the 60s, the circumstances were such that Africa was not able to stand on its own 2 feet. And that made Africa susceptible to external pressure.
Britain and the other big powers had a mandate, as they used to say at that time, a dual mandate, that they had to teach Africans, firstly, how to look after the resources of the continent, and secondly, Africans how to rule themselves, because according to their racist theories, Africans were incapable of doing these things. So again, today, they have the same approach.
Perhaps the most profound way in which colonialism has impacted upon African people is through the miseducation of our people, through the imprisonment of our minds, through the way in which they put African culture as a generality on the defensive and certainly in a subsidiary position, and made us into the cultural orphans and stepchildren.
It interrupted our own path of development along the way that we were beginning to build greater states and solidify polities on the basis of unification, not only of distinct nation groups, but also on a Pan-African basis.
And the colonial experience was perhaps one of the most crushing experiences that Africans have ever witnessed, because what it did was to rob Africa of its dreams and of its visions and of its energy, took away from the African people their own continuity, their own sense of connection to their own philosophers and their great kings and queens and their own people who gave birth to human civilization.
The countries we have in Africa
Astana Conference created at the Berlin Conference. Even after independence, what was handed over to us were boundaries drawn by Europeans for their own benefit and convenience. We had all kinds of amalgamations, all kinds of fusing people together, all kinds of experimentation going on. Experimentation that had nothing to do with the good or the people on the grounds. It was everything about exploitation, everything about acquiring territories.
What came to be called the scramble is highly competitive notion. And the scramble, I want to this part before they get to it. And sometimes they would compromise. They say, okay, you have that part, I have this, etc. And very often the compromises were quite irrational. They didn't make ethnic or cultural sense to the local people, but they divided them.
Who created South Africa? Who created Kenya? Who created Zimbabwe? It is not us. So which means we already said, we're happy you created me as a Kenyan.
So the notion that there is a Democratic Republic of the Congo, for example, is really an imagination in many ways. These countries were divided up based upon European so-called claims to the continent.
History of Zimbabwe, history of Zambia, history of Uganda, as if they've existed as entities from time immemorial. You see, so we started projecting back and creating out of the borders that we've been left with new realities, new histories.
The Red Sea is not the Atlantic Ocean, and people have been going back and forth for thousands of years. Who decided that Madagascar is part of Africa, and yet parts of Yemen and Arabia are considered to be Asia?
A favorite example is the Gambia and Senegal. These are basically one people, but Senegal became French and the Gambia became British.
Civil war in modern day Africa needs to really be traced back to the ways in which Africa was broken up by the colonizers. Today, certainly, you do have a situation where boundaries are very important, and countries attempting to determine their boundaries in the face of this imagination meeting reality. So the reality of different ethnic groups on the continent, the reality of different religions, and the reality that peoples were broken up, not based upon their own cultures and languages, but based upon the interest of European powers. And so many civil wars derive from that. Certainly, issues of factionalism still remain problematic on the continent. But all of these things will be resolved within a framework, within a human rights framework that recognizes the cultural and ethnic differences on the continent.
Has been considerable progress in many parts of Africa. We also know that much of that promise has yet to be fulfilled. Countries like Kenya had a per capita economy larger than South Korea's when I was born. They have badly been outpaced. Disease and conflict have ravaged parts of the African continent. In many places, the hope of my father's generation gave way to cynicism, even despair. Yes, a colonial map that made little sense helped to breed conflict. The West has often approached Africa as a patron or a source of resources rather than a partner.
When you look at the philosophies and opinions of Marcus Garvey, look what Garvey did 100 years ago without internet, without telephone. He has left us a blueprint for economic, social, and political advancement. Why are we not going back to it? I get back to the same issue of value. We don't realize who we are. We reject our greatness because we have been told that only things that come from the West have any value.
It's strange to me that some of us continue to look towards Europe for a solution of our problems. And Europe has said that it's been solving our problems for the last 500 years. We've got the IMF, we've got the World Bank, we've got all kinds of European-dominated institutions saying that they're solving our problems. And each year, our problems gets worse. It seems to me that we need to recognize something. If this doctor has been treating the patient for 500 years and the patient continues to get worse, we have to begin to suspect that there is something wrong with the doctor and his medicine. And if in a context in which the patient had taken good care of himself for 5,000 years before, it is stupid for that patient to continue to believe in this quack doctor. We know that this so-called doctor is a doctor of death, that the IMF and the World Bank have a program to continue the impoverishment of Africa. African people do not owe these people any debt.
Tony Blair talks about Africa being a scar on the conscience of humanity, but he never talks about where this scar came from. Who inflicted this scar on the African continent? Who is responsible for it? And who continues to inflict that scar on the African continent? Because it's very often those same forces, those same countries that are responsible for causing the problems that now pose as those who can solve them.
It's problematic that any time you hear anything about Africa, it has to do with either a child crying or bodies lying in the street. And unfortunately, people have even become desensitized to violence in Africa.
You have to see for yourself. Those images are propaganda. It's just to let us in the Caribbean, the people that's in the Caribbean, not know themselves and their culture.
Yes, it is true that external forces play a role in that, but we also have to face up the fact of our own capacity, our own agency, our own free will to take responsibility for our role in that. We cannot blame everything on the European because it is us who are raping one another in the Congo. It is us who are making children in the South. So yes, they supply the guns. Yes, they supply the greed in terms of if we bring out the diamonds, they use them. Corruption is a sociology. A thief acts alone, but a corrupt person needs another partner, and that partner is consistently European. But we are not going to get out of this unless we take responsibility for doing so.
Somehow or another, we've gotten to a place where Africa is treated like a stepchild, and that somehow this notion of human rights is a gift that the West, that Europe and the US has bestowed upon Africa. Nothing could be farther from the truth. African civil society has been rallying and crying out for generations for human rights to be respected. Now, certainly we must look at human rights from a cultural perspective. First and foremost, human rights is not going to look in the United States like it would in Senegal, or it's not going to look the way it would in Peru if we respect cultural norms.
Europeans cannot teach Africa about human rights. They themselves, when they were ruling us, they did not practice human rights, and they use this gospel of human rights selectively.
It has nothing to do
with how Europe developed. Europe developed by setting the gun and black powder and violence and terrorism to acquire colonies, to assassinate and murder and terrorize whole nations of people, to practice genocide against them in the quest for their resources and wealth, and then to turn around and say, but for you to reacquire these things, you must accept our governance and our instruments of governance, because our way of doing things are the best ways for you. And we reject that at every level of expression.
There are many human rights violations going on in Africa, some of which are certainly, again, the vestiges of colonialism, in ways in which people were divided by colonial powers. And then you have the cases in Africa where multinational corporations abuse the people on the continent. You have situations where there is not good governance, and governments are not beholden to their people. Many times they're beholden to other governments. They're beholden to Western governments. They're beholden to multinational corporations. And so in that way, you see a real exploitation of the notion of democracy instead of real democracy.
You know, there's something obviously wrong because it hasn't worked. It's not working. It won't work. So it means that there are other systems, but we need to do our work properly. We need to reset. What else can we do?
Africa should be left on her own to carve out a democracy that suits the prevailing conditions of that particular country.
In the 21st century, capable, reliable, and transparent institutions are the key to success. Strong parliaments, honest police forces, independent judges, an independent press, a vibrant private sector, a civil society. Those are the things that give life to democracy.
We moved freely as African peoples on the continent of Africa. You know, our history speaks to this. Many of the peoples that now inhabit modern-day nation-states all over Africa, wherever they are now is not where they began as peoples. Many of the peoples in some of the countries today that we would call Kenya, Namibia, Ethiopia, South Africa, many of the countries in Africa, this is something that is very much part of our history.
And I do believe, for me, coming from that background of a nomad, that once I'm free to move from a place to place, respect grows in naturally, you know, because I know no Maasai, no nomad, even if you go to West Africa, the other side, no nomad would come and find 5 acres of land planted with mealies or maize or beans and bring his cattle in there. No.
So why is it today, in this modern era, we have limitations and restriction of movement, freedom of movement on the continent of Africa? Why is it we have nationals of particular African countries that need visas to travel to even sometimes bordering African countries? This is shameful. This is absolutely shameful.
But the most important issue is, what does it mean to be able to relax laws that allow people to come and go? You increase trade. You increase even educational exchange, because now students who may want to travel at the University of Accra, you know, they don't have to go through these loops and hoops and everything. They can go freely. It also, I think, creates a sense of solidarity, because it's really creating a system or a situation where you feel like it's states and you're traveling within states but within one continent, one country, this country called Africa.
Well, you can't have one economic space without free movement of people. You can't have one political space without free movement of people. And so free movement of people has to be at the center of it all. And indeed it is, I think, one of the main, not only instruments of integration, but also the objective of that integration. The whole purpose of Pan-Africanism is that Africans should be free to move within the whole continent.
So it is for you to come together and give us a United States of Africa. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We are not going to be arrested as a God never intended it, and we're not going to build God's confidence in us as men. We are men, human beings, capable of the same acts as any other race. Now Africa's been sleeping, not dead, only sleeping. Today Africa's walking around not only on our feet, but on our brains. You can enslave as was done for 300 years the bodies of men. You can tackle the hands of men. You can tackle the feet of men. You can imprison the bodies of men, but you cannot tackle or imprison the minds of men.
We were neither Fanti or Ashanti, Igbo or Yoruba. We lost those narrow ethnic differentiations when we were brought to the Caribbean. So we were able to develop the identity of African. We were able to identify with the whole of the African continent. So in a sense, that is our peculiar gift to the extended African family.
Because from the very moment that captives landed in the Americas, they were interested in how other captives throughout the Americas were struggling.
Pan-Africanism before the 1940s or 1950s had very much been centered on the diaspora, on Africans abroad. But after 1945, during the 1950s, Pan-Africanism really became centered within the African continent. And particularly when African countries became politically, formally independent.
Here at the African Union, the battle is to die a tribe and be born a nation. One African nation, one that Africans, wherever they are in the diaspora, can be proud of and participate and contribute to in terms of building our humanity.
Even within Europe, single countries have recognized the need for unity to solidify their interests, not only in Europe, but more importantly, in the rest of the global world. We as African people have to do the same.
Pan-Africanism is a political and cultural phenomenon that has its source deep in the history of African people in this part of the world. Pan-Africanism is a form of resistance to the racist oppression that was visited upon African people in the New World.
We've had a common history and a common experience, and we have a common struggle. And a lot of that struggle has to do with the fight against racism, and the fight against imperialism, and that it's been an international oppression. And so Pan-Africanism says that we can learn from each other, we should work in solidarity with each other in the African world.
If imperialism and colonialism were built on Africa's backs, then we also know that it is us who has the task of burying it.
Unfortunately, the structures of the states we have do not permit this. In fact, if you look at our history over the past 50 years very closely, you would notice that with independence, we build more barriers between ourselves.
African leaders have for a long time thought that this would erode their sovereignty.
Sovereignty for artificial creations of the colonial powers is the sovereignty that Gambia enjoys equal to the sovereignty of the United States? It is foolhardy to say so. What America can do, Gambia cannot do. Either in Gambia or on the international platform. So sovereignty, again, is not a holy cow.
Back in 1963, one of the main issues was that the newly independent African countries and presidents thought that Nkrumah was putting the cart before the horse, they say, because we weren't ready then.
The big African countries were under heavy influence from the United States, and they insisted that Africa was not ripe for unity, and that Africa should democratize, should develop first before uniting, which was the position of the United States as a way of rejecting African unity. But Gaddafi insisted that even with a few countries, Africa can start a United States of Africa, and then those who want to join can join later one by one. And Gaddafi won, his argument won, but with a compromise, that instead of a United States of Africa, there will be a union of African states in the form of the African Union, which was a concept copied from the European Union.
But the change that was made then was that, to some extent, Pan-Africanism became a Pan-Africanism of governments, perhaps more than a Pan-Africanism of people.
The AU is a young organization, but even now it has taken on some heavy peacekeeping burdens, of the peacekeeping burden in Darfur, for example, and in other areas, has really been a learn as you grow scenario for the AU. It's important to note that the AU cannot solve all the problems. No multilateral body can solve all the problems of any continent. But I think the AU is a very positive step forward. The more that the regional bodies work together, the more that the AU countries work together to ensure the interest of their people, the more that we're going to see very positive effects sprouting up from the continent of Africa rather than being imposed.
In the case of Rwanda, it's not really magic. That's all of a sudden, as I told you, from 1963 to 1994, the total number of university graduates are less than the total number of graduates only this year. So what has been done? It's because of the leadership. A vision leadership saying, for this one here, we stopped the war, nobody helped us, we have to rebuild our own country in the way that what happened should never happen again. And then you see it through. You put all the bricks in order to make sure that you create the whole good foundation for real development, for sustainable development. Now, if you have a leader who can really think through and create this basis for governance, development will go very fast, as what is happening in Rwanda. We are the worst. We had almost been written off. But for us to be where we are now, where you could see that is real progress happening, really, it's not money from outside. It's not someone from outside who came to say, well, let's take over and organize your country. It's the Rwandese who said, you have to be an example of how a country can change and show the world that with this one here, we can never allow this situation to happen in Rwanda again. And if we can do it and do it right, then there's no reason why it cannot happen in any other country, if you have good leadership. So the point you are making of good leadership is very, very crucial. No matter what you do, if you have bad leadership, things cannot move.
This is about more than just holding elections. It's also about what happens between elections. Repression can take many forms, and too many nations, even those that have elections, are plagued by problems that condemn their people to poverty. No country is going to create wealth if its leaders exploit the economy to enrich themselves. Or if police can be bought off by drug traffickers. No business wants to invest in a place where the government skims 20% off the top, or the head of the Port Authority is corrupt. No person wants to live in a society where the rule of law gives way to the rule of brutality and bribery. That is not democracy, that is tyranny, even if occasionally you sprinkle an election in there.
Any man president in Africa that has to be in power for 2 times, 3 times is nothing but dictators. Because the people never voted for you, maybe once, but no, never. But I tell you what,
because we don't have people to say, hey, you have to leave.
African leaders have got to learn that part of good governance is instituting a credible transition from one leader to the other. That's how you build confidence in the system.
Good leadership, I'm not saying how long you have stayed in the power. I'm just saying I wish you to stay long and do good. Maybe that would be helpful. But here, I'm just talking about really visionary leaders who care for their people, who have created institutions, who have allowed the system, the people, to take decisions so they can move forward, who could allow the whole continent really to participate. And really, once you have those kind of visionary leaders, once you have the people who care really so much, then other things would be possible, other problems would be addressed. So really we needed examples of the good leaders.
In places like Ghana, young people make up over half of the population. And here is what you must know. The world will be what you make of it. You have the power to hold your leaders accountable and to build institutions that serve the people. You can serve in your communities and harness your energy and education to create new wealth and build new connections to the world. You can conquer disease and end conflicts and make change from the bottom up. You can do that. Yes, you can. Because in this moment, history is on the move. But these things can only be done if all of you take responsibility for your future.
Ancient Egypt is significant because it is one of the oldest civilizations known to man. It is the oldest documented civilization known to humanity, and it thrived for almost 3,000 years.
This is where the great king Menes from the south of Egypt united 42 different ethnic groups or clans, brought them together in one nation, and gave the world its first nation, the nation of Kemet.
You find in Kemet the beginning of writing, beginning of government, architecture, science, philosophy, theology, astronomy, so many things that are acknowledged as the hallmark of culture and civilization had their beginnings in Kemet. And so Kemet was the first and oldest, most stable government known to man.
It is also that Nile Valley that gives us Nubia, and the great civilization of Nubia, where you had 42 queens ruling in Nubia. This is more queens ruled in Nubia than in all of the other ancient civilizations combined. This is also the land of Aksum, the great kingdom of Aksum that defeated Nubia and then succeeded as the third great civilization of Africa. In fact, one time it was considered one of the 4 greatest civilizations in the world. Aksum gave way to the great power of Ghana, and Ghana lasted 1,500 years. That's a long time for a nation to exist.
Christianity, Islam, and Judaism get the fundamentals from ancient Egypt, and this is no longer contestable. The dominant ideas in many of those, in all of those religions, would be like resurrection and judgment. The idea that we have a soul, all of these come from ancient Egypt. The word for soul in ancient Egypt was ba. Some people say ka, soul or spirit.
The ancient Egyptians believed that when somebody died, that person's ka underwent a journey in the underworld. It was challenged and it had to overcome those challenges through use of knowledge. And then they arrived at a place called the Hall of Mahati, which is a hall of truth and justice. And the person's heart was weighed against a feather. Now, here are symbolisms that are alive in Western culture today and in Eastern culture, and we show the origins in ancient Egypt. The heart symbolized conscious knowledge, consciousness. And our consciousness, or our conscience, was weighed against a feather, which symbolized truth, ma'at. And we had to recite the 42 declarations of innocence without blemish. And what that simply means is that if at any time we were reciting something and we knew it to be false, our heart would become heavy. And again, you see a formulation that's alive in languages across the world today. Our heart would become heavy and it would outweigh the feather, and we will be devoured by a beast and be sent to Amenti, which is hell in ancient Egyptian. Now that whole formulation is alive in Islam, Christianity, and Judaism today, down to the details.
The motivation behind the building of the pyramids and the temples have to do with the ancient Kemetic understanding of Ma'at. Generally speaking, Ma'at is the force that represents the principles of unity, balance, harmony, order, reciprocity, and that everything within the universe functions in accordance to these principles. And since the earth mirrors what is in the heavens, then by understanding these concepts and principles, how they express themselves, how they repeat themselves, and understanding the cyclical nature of these patterns, then one can begin to master your domain on earth.
So in Egypt, ancient Egypt, those value systems as Ma'at and Ling were some of the things that underpinned the great advances in all its other institutions. And when that core value begins to move away, or it begins to become flawed, the institutions then begin to degenerate.
In 1324, Mansa Musa, the ruler of Mali, made pilgrimage to Mecca with over 72,000 followers. He carried 15,000 camels laden with gold. He changed the economy of every country that he reached. We find that in Timbuktu, it was a great center of learning. It was a melting pot where the Mandinka, the Soninke, where the Tuaregs, where all the different nations came together, and they were able to reach by the 16th century the pinnacle of scholarship.
When the Prophet Muhammad began to preach in Arabia, there were a lot of vested interests in Mecca. Mecca was a trading center. It wasn't as important as it is today, but it was important enough as a trading center. The tribe protected him for a while he was proclaiming these new beliefs, which were challenging the status quo. And then the tribe got fed up with this young man, was causing havoc in relations between tribes, causing havoc in trade. So there was an immediate danger that the converts to Islam would be persecuted.
And so at that point, when his followers were being tortured and killed, he looked not to Rome, not to Persia, not to Yemen, but he sent his followers to Ethiopia, to Aksum, al-Habasha. There, he told his followers, you will find a righteous king. He oppresses nobody, and he does not allow anybody to oppress him. He said, Ethiopia, Al-Habasha, is a land of truth. Hiya ardu sidq. Go there until Allah will decide your fate.
Africa is the richest continent in the world,
Father,
with the poorest people. It has the longest history, but Africans are generally the ones who are most ignorant about their own history.
History has really been written from the perspective of colonizers, and this has gone on in a sense when you've had Western education, you know, the institutions that were set up, the various universities throughout Africa, the kind of products that we've had. Sometimes the models, the paradigms that we've used, that have been taught, still it's kind of regurgitates, keep on reproducing the cycle.
Know any of these books written by real Egyptian person, and it's translated to Arabic by the Egyptians writers, but no one of the Egyptians have been write any book about ancient history. So the foreign people, or the English, or the Germans, or the French, or the Dutch, or the Americans, they write what they want, not what is the truth. They never tell the truth.
It comes, the destruction of African culture, into three phases. Number one, repress them, ignore them, and in the same time loot whatever is their value, bring them into the museum. If you look now today at all the European museums, you find all African history and pieces with the sacred being religious on everything. But in the same time they consider primitive. That's a contradiction in terms.
And also there's a lot to do in terms of the politics of scholarship and publication, you know, in terms of where the most popular, the dominant, the flourishing publishing houses are, and the kind of things that they're interested in. You want to think of the fact that people like Sheikh Anta Diop with the African origin of civilization had problems with their work when they were first presenting it, you know, using radiocarbon activity, etc., to prove, you know, African origins of civilizations or age-old civilizations, things like that.
You know, as long as Europeans have been writing history, they will always put themselves at the head of the story. As Winston Churchill famously said, history will be kind to the British because I will write it. And so as long as Europeans write their history, they will insert themselves in places in history where they don't belong. And until you understand, until we understand our history and our rightful place in our history, we'll never be able to correct the mental challenges that prevent us from knowing who we are and becoming who we can be. So history is a weapon that can be used to subjugate the minds, the consciousness, and the bodies of a people. It's a powerful tool.
History has four fundamental functions. First, we study it to learn its lesson. That's what Malcolm means when he said, of all our studies, history is best prepared to reward our research. Second, we study history in order to absorb its spirit of human possibility. For as Garvey said, what humans have done, humans can do. When we look at our history, see what we've done, know what we're capable of, in spite of the conditions around us. Third, we study this history in order to extract and emulate models of human excellence and human possibility. There is no culture more rich and certainly none more sacred than our own. Listen, if we don't have prophets, there are no prophets. See, if Malcolm and Muhammad and Ella Baker and Soldier of the Truth and Eric Tubman and the rest of them and Yah Sango, if they're not prophets, there are no prophets. They're not saints, there are no saints. They can take their position. Our history is safe. And those models of excellence and achievement instruct our children and ourselves what our life should be about. Finally, we study history to honor the moral obligation to remember. As Father Elohim has said, there are two things we should care about. Never to forget where we came from. Always praise the bridges that carried us over. History, I conclude, as Malcolm said, is our memory. If we lose our memory, we lose our mind. If we lose our mind, how questions everyone must have and answer in practice. Who am I? Am I really who I am? And am I all I want to be?
Every generation, as Vernon said, has to deal with what is the situation on the ground that they are challenged with. To look at that situation, to look at our mission, discover it, fulfill it, or betray it. And that's one of our responsibilities that we've taken up, to try to always put that demand on us, to put that legacy on top of us, to put that litmus test to us, to put that mirror in front of us and say, have we found our mission?
Okay, let me stop that, my royal family. And that is the end of ALKEBULAN. Not the end, but you know, the end of this video here. And I'm going back here because I have a few things to say. Love showing images of ourselves. And this is so beautiful to see us. And I'm going to, let me look at this here. Well, let me see. This symbol grabs me the most. Well, my royal family, the King series is back. And also, I'm going to redo all those videos that I did before in honor of our kings, and I'm going to even do them even better and stronger, because I have learned a lot in my research. When you research this stuff, the person is doing the research, they're learning too as well. So like I said, when I did the first King series, it became spiritual for me. And I have no problem redoing the whole thing over. I have that much love for the royal family. I'm not going to let the enemy conquer me like that. So I know I make all types of different videos. And the reason why I make all these different videos, I want to show the depths and the levels of how I personally have been affected by this system. I might come on there one day sad and crying. I might come on there raging and going off on the enemy. I might come on there very sweet and tender. But I never come with disrespect to the royal family. I truly understand that we have been affected by this system, and there is nothing wrong expressing yourself, but we must also show total respect for the royal family. And we have to, it's for our utter survival, set our own code of conduct and stick with our people. We are God's people. We are not of them. And we really need to stop trying to meet up to their standards. Because when you try to meet up to their standards, you are lowering yourselves. Well, my royal family, I know this video is quite long. And there is no way that I could approach this King series sloppy We are that special. We are that grand. And also, we are never proud. We are most humble. Stay humble. Please keep proud out of your vocabulary, because when you say I'm proud of this and I'm proud of that, eventually, not the all, will become arrogant. Be most humble that you and I are the true chosen ones. And we must demonstrate that before the world and also within our own community, in our personal households. We have to demonstrate how special we truly is. With that said, my royal family, Ashe.